Hi everyone, and welcome to Right Design for Communication, a series of digital productions from Deaf Scotland, showcasing a future vision where the design of the world around us has hearing impaired people in mind, as well as others living with sensory loss and disabilities. The format of these productions will include a presentation from our guest, followed by a short Q&A. The second of this episode of this series, we'd like to welcome Brian McArthur, partner at AMP Architects in Glasgow. Brian has been an architect for more than 30 years and has worked collaboratively for over 10 years delivering projects throughout the east of Scotland across various residential, educational, industrial and healthcare sectors. He has led multidisciplinary teams on Scottish Courts Framework, West Lothian Council, Stirling Council Framework, Strathclyde Transport Framework, Strathclyde Fire and Rescue Framework, Midlothian Council and Midlothian Council Framework. 33 years of experience as a practicing architect here and overseas, with a 15-year track record of designing primary schools and nurseries, and currently working on social and affordable housing from the west to east coast. Now, without further delay, I'd like to pass over to Brian.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to quickly talk about the current building technical standards for Scotland and how they impact upon the hearing environment. And the first thing to note is that our building standards are divided into domestic and non-domestic. And as you can see, they're subdivided into 7 sections, and the 5th section is noise. And really the standards are more applicable to noise rather than the acoustic and hearing environment. And I think there's space for improvement within our building standards. So noise has 2 sections within it. And by comparison, fire has 15 sections, 5 annexes. Environment has 36 sections. Safety has 14 sections, and sustainability has 7 annexes. So it's fair to say noise and acoustics really are not high in importance within the technical standards of Scotland at the moment. And noise really concentrates on the transmission of noise between apartments and rooms. It's not really about improving the sort of like listening environment. And in actual fact, it's not really until page 300 and something where they actually mention acoustics within the building standards. So it's fair to say it's a low priority within the building standards. And given that every new build in Scotland has to comply with the building standards, I think we're missing a trick. I think there is room for significant improvement. And I think the road to that improvement is not really that difficult either. I think there's quite clear pathways where we could improve the listening and hearing environment. Now, while the building standards are seen as a minimum standard we should comply with, it's also true that it's not often that we exceed the building standards. We're asked to meet them, but rarely as architects asked to exceed them. There are some exceptions to that, of course. If you're trying to sell a very expensive house, you might have some special items of equipment in there or higher standards adopted, but by and large, most buildings that we design have to meet a value for money standard, particularly if it comes from the public purse. So often we really are just designing to meet the building standards rather than exceed the building standards. Now, a couple of general comments. The building regulations, as I've said, are the minimum standards, and where it pertains to noise and acoustics, we are not really world leaders in this aspect. The World Health Organization, obviously when they're not dealing with pandemics, also advocate for a minimum standard in dwellings, and their minimum standard requires the acoustic separation in our houses to be better than what the Scottish Government currently advocate. So we are in no way world leaders in the acoustic environment, although being one of the leading economies. So I think there is a significant area where the building standards are just silent. And that's because they concentrate on noise, which is about the noise between apartments or the noise coming into your dwelling, or the noise generated if you're a factory or a warehouse. There's limits on that. There's limits on the equipment you can put on a roof for air conditioning and things like that, so they don't blight your neighbour's enjoyment. But the building standards are pretty silent on things that are required for effective communication, such as adequate lighting so that lip readers can see somebody speaking, or limiting background noise. I think we've all struggled to buy a rail ticket at some point because of the background noise, whereas there's no standards at the moment or reason for anybody to improve these sort of aspects. Now, there is one notable exception within the Scottish building regulations, or Scottish building technical standards, and that's to do with schools. There is a document called Building Bulletin 93, which sets out enhanced recommendations for the learning and teaching environment. And not only does it tell you what the acoustic separation should be, so that if your classroom happens to be next to the dining hall or the gym hall, you're not constantly interrupted by the noises of people enjoying their lunch or playing sport, and the teacher can get on with the business of teaching. But they actually do talk about the reverberation time within the room as well. And the reverberation time is very important in making sure that the teacher can be heard and can communicate to the back of the class without having to shout or strain their voice in being heard. And it also allows the room to have enough chatter and noise so that some noises outside or elsewhere in the school do not impose on the children. So what I would say is our schools are adequately covered with regards to advice. But what I would say is it is advice. These are only recommendations. They're not requirements as per the building technical standards. But most councils accept that you need a very good teaching environment. So most of our new schools are designed to Building Bulletin 93. Unfortunately, very few other public buildings are designed, and with the exception of the requirement for an induction loop, generally there's very little additional thought required of the architects and the architectural community when designing a public building. So, as the introduction said, I do have a lot of experience, and therefore I have some ideas with regards to what we might be able to do with the building regulations. But the first thing I would say is that we do quite a lot of work in kind of retrofitting and trying to resolve issues, generally between residents and occupants in substandard housing. And when I say substandard, I mean there was no insulation fitted in these houses, so you can clearly hear your neighbour's telly if it's turned up a notch or two. You can hear your neighbour above walking about. You can hear the neighbours below as well. So what that has taught us is that the retrofitting is exponentially more difficult than getting it right first time. So it's better to build right the first time rather than to hope you can come back and enhance what you're doing later on. Often retrofitting just cannot solve the same problems that you could eliminate when building new. So that would be a huge lessons learned. So can our building standards help drive improvements? And yes, they can. We already have certain advantages. Over the course of the 30-year career, I've seen enormous changes in certain sections of the building regs, most notably insulation and energy standards, safety, access. We're currently at the moment concentrating a lot on fire. We're realising some of the fire solutions that we've adopted are perhaps not as adequate as they should be. So there's quite a lot of review going on within the community with regards to fire. Energy's always been high on the agenda since 1970. And again, with our surge towards carbon neutral and our acknowledgement by many councils and governments that we have a climate crisis at the moment. So we're seeing lots of work on the building regs. The good news is the building standards are improved periodically. There's almost constantly a review happening. So there is an opportunity to get in there and influence parts of it. And as we showed at the outset, the section under noise, which probably should be called acoustics rather than noise, is underrepresented within the standard. So there's a clear opportunity there for us to influence and improve what we build. Just an example of how the technical standards change. When I first started, I designed and built buildings which sometimes didn't have any insulation in them. There was no real requirement. We used to get away with just putting 50 mil of insulation around the perimeter of the ground floor slab, just 1 meter depth, that was all. So the middle of the slab didn't have any insulation at all. And that was only like 25 years ago. Our wall would be made up of masonry, 50 mil of insulation in the cavity, and masonry. And that was all. And only sometimes did we put some insulation in the roof. Now we're putting 150 mil of high performing insulation across the whole of the ground floor slab. We're putting 200 mil of insulation into our walls, and we're putting 150 to 200 mil of insulation, sometimes 300 mil of insulation into our roofs. So we're talking about a threefold, fivefold improvement in energy standards over 25 years. So, you know, it's phenomenal what we have done. Now, as part of these standards as well, we have experts coming on site to do a whole bunch of testing. So we have experts that come on site before we complete a new building, and they have to test for air leakage to make sure there's not lots of drafts, a lot of heat escaping out of our buildings. And again, we're seeing the limits on air leakage reducing almost every 2 years. There are certain standards that are telling us to make our buildings more and more airtight. We still have ventilation and trickle vents in the windows. We can still open the windows, but middle of winter, we should be able to not lose as much energy through the fabric. Now, these experts are on site. We've got greater visibility. The whole of the building industry is taking notice. We're doing something about it. Now, we also have another advantage. All newly completed homes must have on-site acoustic testing too, and then they're certified by an acoustician before you can get your completion certificate and allow occupants to come and use the new building. So straight away, we have people on site, experts, the expert equipment coming and testing that our buildings don't transmit sound between certain rooms or between certain homes. But what they don't do, and there's no compulsion within the regulations, to do any checks with regards to speech intelligibility, reduction of background noise, all these things that would improve the environment and improve communication, particularly for people that have some form of sensory deprivation. So with the experts already on site doing certain tests for noise, I think it should be a reasonably simple step to expand that and ask them, using the same equipment, to do some tests with regards to reverberation time, with regards to the quantum of absorbing material within an environment. Now, I wouldn't say it has to be everywhere, but you could ask for it to be, for instance, in a railway station where you're going to be buying tickets. Set out some standards and ask them to comply with those standards. The guy's going to be on site anyway, doing other tests. It would make sense, and kind of pushing against an open door, to have some additional standards introduced under the kind of paltry section that is Section 5 noise, which says that we want in certain public buildings an enhanced environment. One of the lessons from the introduction of the Disability Design Act is that what we found is an environment, a public environment that was designed for people with disability was an enhanced environment, not just for people with disability, but in actual fact, an enhanced environment for everybody. And this would be the same with an enhanced acoustic environment. It wouldn't just aid those with a particular sensory disability, but it's actually going to aid everybody, because communication will be easier. We wouldn't be straining to hear what the ticket seller would be saying or whatever. Things would just be easier for all. So, because, as I said, the acousticians have to be on site carrying out tests, it should be easy enough to get more people involved. And what I would say is, one of the reasons why we need to concentrate on this is because we're often spending tax money and using funds from the public purse. We have to make sure they're hard wearing, they're not a maintenance burden. So we end up specifying floor and wall surfaces that are very, very hard, that create additional echo and background noise. But it should be easy enough to then design a ceiling or a higher level wall surface which has greater absorption. There is actually products on the market that have Class A absorption qualities that would allow you to then just limit the echo and make background noise a little bit better. We should be able to also adequately light areas where communication happens that would aid lip readers. But in my 30 years of practice, never once have I been asked for this. And I've designed healthcare, doctor surgeries, places where the occupiers, the users, are perhaps more enlightened. But in 30 years, I've never been asked for this enhancement. And I suspect, unless people are made to comply, or at least consider these parts of the building design, we're not going to get that change. So I think we need to kind of press and push for that change, because it will be to the benefit of everyone. What I'd like to say as well is that, some of the changes that I've thought of, shopping malls can be very noisy, distracting. There is space in the walls and the ceilings, the underside of the upper floors where we can put absorption in. So maybe we could limit reverberation times within shopping malls. In shopping malls, we should maybe have areas that are quieter, that are better lit, particularly in things like music venues, pubs and clubs, areas around the bar where you communicate. Maybe there could be one section that could be with an additional light that can be switched on to have an easier conversation, see what's happening. And one particular bugbear could be limit the noise level within shops that sell trainers. When I take my children there to buy them new trainers, I'm often driven out just by the loud music that I don't appreciate. So, but one of, to be a bit more serious, another bugbear that really, really annoys me, and it's a simple thing. When you're at a train station, all the information is at high level so that many people can see it. And when you move around lots of other places, the information is placed at eye level where you can't really see it. And if somebody's standing in front of you, you're totally blocked. You don't know what's happening. And take the case of a lift. Sometimes the lift button is placed here. And if you get somebody tall like myself, standing at the buttons, and you're a wee bit smaller, you can't see what floor you're on, you can't hear what floor you're on. Whereas a simple regulation that said something like, there should also be an indication above the door then everybody could see what floor they were at. So sometimes it's quite simple things that would really kind of drive improvements. So the building standards, in conclusion, this is the conclusion this time. They are produced by the Scottish Government and are the responsibility of the Scottish ministers. Now, the good news is they're constantly under review. Typically, for the past 10 years, I would say there's been a new version of the building regs that come out every 2 years. They were last updated in March 2019, and the next update is in March 2021, and there's going to be significant changes. Basically, they're going to ask for automatic fire suppression systems, which are essentially sprinklers, to be put into all new flats, maisonettes, all new social housing, and places like care homes. They're all going to, it's going to be mandatory. And as soon as it's mandatory, it's going to have implications. There are lots of implications to putting a sprinkler system in. It means there's an annual maintenance that has to be carried out. There's an additional initial expense. There's the danger of leak. There's also space needed for the sprinkler tank. Scottish Water have to commit to being able to provide water. So there's lots of, from this one small change, there's a lot of knock-on effects. I'm hopeful that if there was a couple of small changes within the building regs with regards to the acoustic environment, it could have a knock-on positive effect. Now, we know that the regulations will probably be amended again in another couple of years. At the moment, we know there's research going on external wall cladding in multi-storey residential buildings. We know there's a scheme for certification for fire stopping. And of course, these have all been born out of the high-profile Grenfell tragedy that happened 3.5 years ago, and still we haven't done anything about it. We're still talking about doing something about it, but haven't quite done it yet. So surely there must also be some space for improvements in what is a very thin 2-section chapter on noise, and change that to acoustics. So in conclusion, my final conclusion, who are the responsible Scottish ministers? Well, we've got Mr. Kevin Stewart, MSP. He is the minister directly responsible for building standards. So he might be a good person to speak to. And he answers directly to the Cabinet Minister, Aileen Campbell. She is the capo de capo. She's in charge of local government. Now both of them have been in post for over 3 years. So they've obviously got to grips with their brief. And I would suggest they are some people that we would perhaps like to engage with. And that really is a quick run through the building standards as they apply to the acoustic environment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brian. We're now moving on to the Q&A portion of the showcase. So the first question that we have is, do you think current building standards work for those affected by deafness and other sensory issues?
I think it was pretty clear from the presentation. It's a paltry section within the building standards. It's been given not much more than a cursory piece of legislation to deal with noise entering your dwelling or your noise emanating from your office or place of work. So that's a resounding no, they don't work. But I think they can be made to work. I think there's just a couple of things that need to be added. So I do think there's an opportunity there.
And do you think there's any inconsistencies between acoustic standards and their application in schools and other public buildings?
Yes. I've designed, in particularly private schools, some units for additional support needs where acoustics have been very, very important. Some children suffer from sensory overload and too much noise. The school bell can be a trigger and things like that. So sometimes you have to design to very particular standards, but even our general new built school environment is built to a standard that is far in excess of what we would normally do for other public buildings. The schools have had particular attention and they benefit from that particular attention, but that same level of attention is sadly lacking in just about every other building type. Occasionally, with the exception of something like a theatre or a concert venue where acoustics is part of the reason for it being there. But in general, something like a library, a multi-use community space, an office, the acoustics aren't really high up the agenda, to be perfectly honest. But they should be.
Thanks. And what changes to legislation and or guidance do you think would assist those affected by deafness or other sensory issues?
Well, as I said, the section under noise, it just deals with noise, but it should really be widened to include acoustics. And the acoustic environment it is to do with noise to a certain extent, but it's also to do with speech intelligibility. I would also want it widened to take into account of things like lighting levels, where there is interaction between somebody selling a service and receiving a service. You know, there should be something in there that said it should be properly lit. I imagine there's nothing worse than being a lip reader and the area is adequately lit, but the person you're speaking to is in silhouette. So you're almost able to see the person, but you can't quite. So there's, again, small things, small bits of legislation, something like in regulation saying that all lifts should have a little, should have an opportunity to put the floor numbers above the door so everybody in the lift can see. These are small things that can all really make a difference, and they're not difficult to do either. People just need to be told, please do it this way rather than that way, and it'd be better. So there's a range of issues there, but most of them are actually quite simple to adopt.
And our final question today, Brian, what recent developments in architecture can you point to that will make buildings more welcoming and accessible to those affected by deafness and other sensory issues?
I think in architecture per se, there's not really, it doesn't really need to be that many developments. We've actually got the tools, we've actually got the training and experience. We know how to model buildings and rooms in 3D to improve the acoustic performance. We're just not compelled to do it that often, with the exception of schools, theatres, music venues, things like that. So I think it's about making sure and putting the legislation in place that ensure that we apply these known techniques, the known science of acoustics, and make sure it's further up the agenda. That would go some way. And the fact that we actually have acousticians at the moment. 5 years ago, you never had an acoustician going to every new house that was built. And we've got this huge programme of new social housing that's going ahead. But 5 years ago, acousticians weren't on site doing tests to every single dwelling. So they've got a far greater public profile, and we should use that and ask them to do a supplementary test to do with speech intelligibility, the sound absorption in public buildings and things like that, so that we can make that part of the acoustic environment just more able to cater for people with deafness or other sensory. And like I said during the presentation, what works for people that have maybe got a sensory deprivation generally enhances the enjoyment for everybody. You know, it's not just an insular thing, it is quite a communal improvement. So, but you know, we did some work with Blackwood Housing Association who deal with people with some kind of profound disabilities, and they're using things like Alexa to control the lights and the television. You know, there are some developments, and you know, smart metering and some of these remote controls where you can set the temperature in your house. There must be something in there as well that can help us. But really, it's just about making people use the known science of acoustics to improve their environment. Just compel people to take it into account, and I think we'll see a huge improvement. That's it.
Well, thank you, Brian, for delivering the illuminating presentation and answering those questions. We hope that it's provided some insight and takeaways to bring to our audience watching today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.